Hello, I'm Harvey Ambrose, and I'm preaching this message today on behalf of the Missionary Baptist Voice of Africa radio program that is broadcast out of our radio station in Monrovia, Liberia. And continuing in our study of the book of Exodus, we come to chapter 8, and we'll begin reading in verse 1. Exodus chapter 8, verse 1. And the Lord spake unto Moses, Go unto Pharaoh, and say unto him, Thus saith the Lord, Let my people go, that they may serve me. And if thou refuse to let them go, behold, I will smite all thy borders with frogs. And the rivers shall bring forth frogs abundantly, which shall go up and come into thine house, and into thy bedchamber, and upon thy bed, and into the house of thy servants, and upon thy people, and into thine ovens, and into thy kneading troughs. And the frogs shall come up, both upon thee, and upon thy people, and upon all thy servants. And the Lord spake unto Moses, saying to Aaron, Stretch forth thine hand with thy rod over the streams, over the rivers, and over the ponds, and cause frogs to come up upon the land of Egypt. And Aaron stretched out his hand over the waters of Egypt, and the frogs came up and covered the land of Egypt. And the magicians did so with their enchantments, and brought up frogs upon the land of Egypt. Then Pharaoh called for Moses and Aaron and said, Entreat the Lord, that he may take away the frogs from me and from my people. And I will let the people go, that they may do sacrifice unto the Lord. And Moses said unto Pharaoh, Glory over me. When shall I entreat for thee, and for thy servants, and for thy people, to destroy the frogs from thee and thy houses, that they may remain in the river only? And Pharaoh said, Tomorrow. And he said, Be it according to thy word, that thou mayest know that there is none like unto the Lord our God. And the frogs shall depart from thee, and from thy houses, and from thy servants, and from thy people. They shall remain in the river only. And Moses and Aaron went out from Pharaoh, and Moses cried unto the Lord because of the frogs which he had brought against Pharaoh. And the Lord did according to the word of Moses, and the frogs died out of the houses, and out of the villages, and out of the fields. And they gathered them together upon heaps, and the land stank. But when Pharaoh saw that there was respite, he hardened his heart, and hearkened not unto them, as the Lord had said. I'll end the reading there. Try to discuss this. So I'm going to take us back to verse 25 of Exodus chapter 7, the last that we read last week, where it says, And 7 days were fulfilled after that the Lord had smitten the river. Now, in the first of the great strikings or judgments in which God put his hand in punishment against the land and the people of Egypt, and particularly its monarch, Pharaoh, the first was turning the water to blood throughout all the land. And that resulted in the death of all those things that lived in the water. And I would assume it would affect vegetation and the growth of vegetation as well. That it would cause putrefaction in all the dead things. And like with all things that are putrefied, stink comes up, and it says the river stunk, and the fish stunk, and the land stunk. It stank. It was a nasty smell. And it lasted 7 days. I don't think I remember saying that it would last, how long it would last, once God turned the waters to blood, but it lasted 7 days. And I think it's worth mentioning that in the Bible, the number 7, in the Hebrew, it has a connotation of holiness. Holiness and sanctification are the two things. To To be holy is to be separate from, not included with other things, not included with that which is profane, but separately distinct from that which is profane. To be holy, to be sanctified from other things. And if you remember the story in Exodus, where God created the heavens and the earth, and in 6 days he did that, and on the seventh day he rested from the work that he had done in creation. And it says that in chapter 2 of the book of Genesis, it says that on the seventh day God ended his work that he had made, and he rested on the seventh day from all his work which he had made. And God blessed the seventh day and sanctified it, or made it holy, because that in it he had rested from all his work which God created and made. So perhaps the first smiting or plague that God did with his own hand against the nation of Egypt and against its king and its people and the very land itself and the animals in it lasted 7 days, to show that it was the holiness of God bringing these signs and wonders upon a world of sinful men. Because of sin, it came to pass. Pharaoh had been warned implicitly and inwardly by the Spirit. Now, by Moses, on behalf of God, Moses is telling him what he needs to do, and he won't do it. He doesn't repent. So, in holiness, God brings judgment upon sinners. People may not like that, but they understand it if they just give it any thought at all. Because when we take things personally, let's theoretically or hypothetically take something personal. Let's say that some robber came into your home at night and killed your wife, just murdered her. Wouldn't you want the powers that be in your nation or in your city, the police and the justice system, to punish the murderer? Wouldn't you feel that there was no God if people just get away with murder? I mean, people do that too. They'll complain, how did God let that person live who murdered my family member? Our very heart recognizes that justice is something that is right. It must be accomplished. Vengeance upon those who do wrong. It must come to pass. God always does that which is right. But somehow when the justice or the judgment comes upon us or upon someone else, even people we don't know, earthquakes come and kill people, tsunamis come and drown people, plagues come and people die of the disease, and we always hear people calling and saying, well, why is it that God allows this? And the answer is sin. I'm not saying that it's directly attributable to people's sin every time, but death altogether has come upon the world of sinful men because of sin. And what methods the Lord allows to happen in order to bring about his judgment over sin, which is always death. You know, sin, when it is full, it brings forth death. Well, that's what's happening to Egypt now. And the particular sin, there's many sins of these people. They are pagan idolaters. They worship everything under the sun and the sun itself. They don't worship the true and the living God. The Egyptians did not. So the Lord puts his hand upon that land and does this. And in the first smiting of Egypt, by turning the waters to blood, it lasts for 7 days, perhaps signifying the holiness of God, and doing that as well as all the subsequent smitings or strikings against that land, the judgments against Egypt, the 9 remaining one, of which we read here in chapter 8, verse 1. The first is bringing frogs out of the waters. Notice that he uses the water, and that it won't be long until he's going to bring a judgment out of the waters which bring life to Egypt, and bring food and wealth and all that. Egypt being known for all of its crops because of the waters of the Nile, and the subsidiaries and tributary streams that lead to it, and the ponds, all the things that they had to control water levels and inventories, to bring forth great produce. He uses that first. He continues with the waters, and he brings up something far less grandiose. I mean, and I guess what I mean by that is the Nile itself, the great waters of Egypt. That's a big thing, and he uses that first. And we spoke before that was, that the Egyptians, even though I don't know that they call the Nile a god, they considered it to be the source of life, which is to make a god out of it, whether they named it a god or not. But God would have them know that he is the source and the sustainer of life. He would have you know that also. Now, when he strikes the water again, this time it's to bring up frogs. Far less consequential than an entire river system and water system in a whole nation. And yet he shows that even through the littlest of things, he can accomplish his will. He can make armies out of anything in his creation. If mankind decides to go to war with God, then we could expect the things which he has created to become enemies against us. And we might think about that sometimes when what we call natural disasters occur, and wonder whether or not those are just creatures in the hands of God doing his bidding in judgment against a world of sinners, of which all of us have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God, and can expect judgment. Now, these frogs came out at the bidding of God through the hand of Moses and Aaron by nothing more than stretching out a rod. That doesn't mean that Moses or Aaron knew the first thing about how to bring frogs out of the river. God just says, bring them out by stretching your rod out over the waters. And they stretched out their rod over the waters, and out come the frogs. God gives us commandments to do things that we don't understand. He tells us that we have to trust him with all of our heart. And yet, and people think, well, that's easy, I'll just do that. As though it's just strictly up to you. You can trust with all your heart just as easily as you could cross the street. But it's not that way. We read in the book of Ephesians that even something like just believing, trusting in God is not something that we're capable of in our natural state. It says in Ephesians chapter 2, speaking about salvation from sin, it says in Ephesians 2 verse 8, for by grace are ye saved through faith, meaning trust. And that, not of yourselves. It is a gift of God, not of works, lest any man should boast. He's clearly saying, for you to have the faith that it takes for God to save you, you must be gifted that faith by the God who will save you. And your doings will not generate that faith. There's nothing about you that's going to generate that faith. So if it comes as a gift from God, then it follows that we must ask God for it. That as we seek to be saved, not understanding salvation, because except a man be born again, he told Nicodemus, he cannot see the kingdom of God. can't even begin to understand it, much less enter into it unless he's born again. Well, how do you how do you birth yourself? How do you cause yourself to be generated? You can't, any more than you could in the far less complicated, simple physical birth into which you were born. You had no control over that. The only control you have about being born again is to desire it and to pray for it and to pray for the blessed gift of eternal life that God gives you through faith, understanding that even the simplest thing, the faith itself, must be given you by God. Now that, I don't know how to make it any simpler than that. If you are a person who has come face to face with guilt and shame over sin, with fear of punishment and judgment from God against you because of what you've done, with an inability to stop sinning. Even if you stopped, how do you pay for old sins? And I don't know of anybody that stopped sinning. Maybe you do. I certainly didn't, nor can I. It still happens. So how are we going to wiggle out of that? Except by the grace, the unmerited favor that God shows us. We need God's help. You can't do this. You can't even begin to do it. All you can do is, if you want to be saved, you have to have a desire to be saved, is to beg God to save you. And to trust that God will do so if you earnestly seek for that salvation. If you continue without ceasing to diligently seek the salvation of God. Now I've gone off on a tangent, but we'll get back to this. You all know the story anyway. You know about the plagues that God brought upon Egypt. This is the second plague, and it's frogs. Notice just how disgusting it is. You know, Pharaoh, perhaps he thought when this great sign of blood came upon the land, well, now he's going to bring God's going to bring some giant army against us. But I'm not worried about that, because I've got a very strong army right here in Egypt. Just let him bring what he wants to. Let him bring whatever horrible thing that he thinks is going to, high and mighty thing that he thinks is going to humble us. Instead, God brings a loathsome, tiny thing out of the rivers, one of the smallest river creatures, a frog out of the waters. But frogs multiplied, no doubt into the many millions, into your bedroom, into your bed, upon your person, into your kitchen, into your oven in your kitchen, into the kneading trough where you're kneading the dough to make your bread. They're everywhere. And as frogs do, they have bodily processes just like we do. They defecate and urinate, and they're doing that mess everywhere. They're everywhere. You can't walk in your house without stepping on a frog. That's the sense I have of it. They cover the land. Every part of it, from the lowest slave in the land, because at this time even the Israelites were plagued by these things, all the way to Pharaoh, his own self, his own person, his own home, his own kitchen, his own oven, all that stuff upon all the people of the land as a punishment. I think it's interesting to note that just as there was blood to start with, the waters were turned to blood, and then come the frogs, both having to do with the waters, that it's the same thing, and we need to contemplate this, I guess, in the book of Revelation. We don't know, I don't know, nor do I think anyone else knows for certain what the final judgments are And I know many people think they do. But when these things in Revelation come to pass, was that speaking about in the destruction of Rome? I think it was. Was that the final fulfillment of it? Perhaps not. Perhaps it is yet future. It seems to me that there is a judgment coming upon the world. The Bible clearly teaches that. Whether or not Revelation is speaking of this or not, it is interesting to me that the plagues that are brought against Egypt are now the same plagues, spoken of differently, but the same plagues are brought upon the whole world, or upon Rome, or whoever this judgment is again. In Revelation chapter 16, it says, 16 verse 4, and the third angel poured out his vial upon the rivers and fountains of water, just like Aaron stretched out his rod upon the rivers and the ponds and the reservoirs and the cisterns. And it says in Revelation, and they became blood. So the rivers and the fountains and all the waters, they became blood in Revelation chapter 16, verse 4. And he also says in verse 6, and because the people had shed blood, that the angel says, well, they've shed blood, so they need to drink blood. Don't give them water anymore. Turn the thing that sustains life, water itself. We're made of water principally. 70% of us is water. And so, yeah, if they're going to be bloody, give them blood to drink. That's what the angel says, the third angel that poured out his vial upon the waters, and they became blood. But then he says, just a little bit further down, it talks about frogs, I think. It says, talks about unclean spirits, yeah. So in verse 13 of Revelation 16, it says, and I saw 3 unclean spirits like frogs come out of the mouth of the dragon, and out of the mouth of the beast, and out of the mouth of the false prophet. For they are the spirits of devils, working miracles, which go forth unto the kings of the earth and of the whole earth to gather them to the battle of the great day of God Almighty. See how that's repeated? First you have waters, life-giving waters, turned into blood and death. And then you have frogs coming out of those same waters, bringing, in the case of Revelation, I think it's unclean spirits, which what they do is they come out and deceive people and turn them away from repentance. Just as Pharaoh would not repent, because his magicians were able to bring, just as they were able to through they would do it secretly, so not in plain sight, so it's a trick. They turned water to blood. Well, they also, through their enchantments, and it's the same word, it means secretly, they were able to bring forth frogs out of water. But it's just interesting that all they do is mimic, the true miracle of the water into blood, or the frogs that covered the land of Egypt. They just mimic it, probably brought forth a frog or something, or appeared to have, rather than making the frogs go away. Now, if these magicians had power, they would have just shoved all those frogs back into the Nile and back into the ponds and other streams, and maybe sent them all down to the ocean. Just cleared the whole land of Egypt from frogs. But we read about in the final judgment that Satan comes with all deceivableness and lying wonders. So it's like, it would appear to be a sign, it would appear to be a miracle, but it's all deception. It's not real. I think there's also suggestions that at the end, the son of perdition, whomever that is someone who pretends to be good, but at the core he's not good. He's the devil. So anyway, I'm digressing from this. I'm not doing a very good job today, but it's just interesting to see the comparisons between these places. This is not the last of them. It's not the end of the comparisons between Revelation and the plagues brought upon the land of Egypt. So the point is that just as they had worshipped the Nile, in a sense, because they thought it was the giver of life, whereas, of course, God is the only giver and sustainer of life, and they therefore worship the creature over the creator, which no telling how many millions of people in this world do that today. Certainly in my country they do. They just worship nature as though nature were a god, and they have no regard for God, who creates and upholds nature himself by the word of his power. You should not be guilty of that. Make sure you don't, because God does not hold people guiltless who worship the creature that he has made over the God who made the creature. So anyway, same way the frogs, they had a goddess called Hekwet, something like that, Hekwet, and she, the false god, there is no such thing, but they imagined, the Egyptians did, that and it's connected with the river, that she was involved in the birthing of children and stuff like that, and so they worshipped frogs, thinking that they were gods. So they got frogs up to their ears. And I think that anything that it's been this way with me, anything that we give ourselves over to love in a sinful way, in other words, to whether it's wealth or fame or power or any number of things that people, sports, collecting, there's no end to what we will turn into gods. But anything that we render our hearts servants to obey or servants to love, it's pretty common that the Lord will use that very thing to punish us. He'll cause it to ruin us. I wonder how many people who have been addicted to alcohol, and they started just slowly to love it, and eventually it completely ruined their lives. Or how many people addicted to sexual immorality ruined their marriages or ruined their lives through such an addiction. Or how many people addicted to power became so consumed in the quest for it, or money, to where that their whole life becomes vain and ill spent because they have made a god out of something. The true God uses that very obsession of theirs to punish them. And that's what happened here. They got more frogs than they could stand. And even though Pharaoh, when the waters of Egypt were turned to blood, he did not petition God to stop it. God just stopped on his own accord at 7 days. Like I say, perhaps showing the holiness, that God is demonstrating that he's going to set himself apart from all these other gods. And he uses the number 7, meaning holiness, in the Hebrew, that to announce that at the get-go. Now this second plague of frogs, starting from the same source, from the water, so the frogs come, but this time, and he wasn't warned of the frogs, by the way. Pharaoh was not warned of the frogs. God just brought the frogs. And Pharaoh, apparently surprised by it or abhorred by it or whatever it was, he finally relents a little bit, and he begs Moses to take them away. It says, Pharaoh called for Moses and Aaron and said, "Entreat the Lord that he may take away frogs from me and from my people, and I will let the people go, that they may do sacrifice." So he promises to let them go, which is all that God has asked for. And yet Pharaoh has resisted. Well, Moses and Aaron, rather than just immediately doing, Moses wants Pharaoh to understand, and no doubt God is instructing Moses to say this. When he says glory over me, what he means by that is, I'll let you be in charge of that. You tell me when you want me to remove the frogs, and that's when they'll go. In other words, otherwise, Pharaoh may have thought, well, they just happened to go away. This was just a bunch of crazy frogs that came in here and went, you know. And so Moses says, no, you pick the time. You pick the very time that you want them gone, and I'm, God, through Moses, is going to make that happen. So you call it. It's your call. And he said, well, tomorrow. And I'm sure Pharaoh was hoping they would have ended that very day, and then he would have said, see, it happened soon. And therefore it was not God, it was just a bunch of frogs. It just happened. It just happens. That's the favorite expression of all the unbelievers today, all the scientists and all things that don't believe in God. The universe just happened. Oh goodness, it was hundreds of billions of years ago, and you just give enough time to anything, and it'll just happen. Everything will come from nothing. Nothing will explode into everything, and this explosion will bring order. Which, of course, we know that explosions destroy; they don't create. And they result in disorganization and, in fact, in disintegration of things. Explosions don't make stuff, they destroy stuff. And yet that's their argument. It just happened. Life just happened. There was some primordial soup that they don't talk about. They don't know what primordial soup. There ain't no such thing as primordial soup, but they're going to say primordial soup. Some little simple cell organisms just happen. And yet, of course, the more we learn that there's no life that is simple. Even single cell organisms are extraordinarily complex, intelligently designed things. But they don't care. It just happened. And so Pharaoh would have loved for the frogs to have gone away that very night rather than the next day. That's the reason he probably picked, well, let's do it tomorrow. He could have said, get rid of these frogs right now. I'm sure he wanted them gone, but he said, make it tomorrow. He wanted to see if they just go away on their own accord, but of course they did not. And so Moses, entreats God for it, and they died, except for the ones that were in the river, and they continued in the river. So the Lord did not destroy all the frogs, just the ones that were outside of the bounds of their normal habitation. And so when they died, of course, they proved that they were real frogs, and they were not just the imaginations of people's minds, because they started decomposing and stinking. Just like the fish stink when they die, the frogs stink when they die. When you die, you're going to stink. Animals stink when they die. It just shows the total corruption that is in the world since sin entered into the world, and death by sin. Before Adam sinned, there was no death in the world. There wasn't the death of creatures. I doubt there was even a death of plants. Things didn't die. Sin entered the world by man, and death by sin. If you want to know why people die, that's the answer. So anyway, they stunk, which proves just how real they were. I'm sure the stench stayed around for a while. They started burning them. They piled them into heaps, the Egyptians did, and they burned them. Okay, they gathered them up from all the places where they had died. They were just all over the land. Of course, they were in ovens. They had to get them out of the oven. They had to get them out of their beds. They had to get them off their person, get them out of their house, get them out of their fields, get them out of their feeding troughs, get them out of their watering troughs, get them out of everything, and pile up the bodies and burn them. And it stunk. And now Pharaoh had said, if God does this, I'll let the people go and worship him. But then he didn't do that. He lied. He said, but here's what it says in verse 15. But when Pharaoh saw that there was respite, meaning that there was a relief, that the frogs went away. When the thing that was causing his problem went away, he hardened his heart. It doesn't even say that God hardened his heart like God had said he would. The fact that God was merciful and heard his prayer through Moses and Aaron, that the frogs would go away, and God said, okay, I'll send the frogs away when you want. Okay, tomorrow? Okay, I'll do it tomorrow. The frogs are gone. And Pharaoh's like, whew, the frogs are gone. You know what? I'm not going to let those people go. I was like that. I may have told you before. I don't know if I did or not, but about 10 years ago, I had no, it was longer than that. Goodness, how long ago was it? Ages. It was 1986. You can do the math. But I had a horse riding accident. And it threw me to the ground, and the horse tripped and fell over me, and it caused my spleen to rupture. Now, I didn't know that my spleen had ruptured, and the doctors didn't know that for a long time, and they kept thinking it was broken ribs or something, but eventually they discovered that I was bleeding to death internally, and that I had very little time to live. And I was in a tiny hospital in the middle of nowhere, and I didn't trust them because of all their misdiagnosis that they had had up to that point. And I said, well, I want to be life flighted to Salt Lake City. That was the nearest major hospital. And they said, well, you probably won't make it. I said, well, whatever. I'm not going to make it with people like you. So they put me on a plane. But they'd already told the hospital, the life flight people, they said, yeah, he's fading off into the sunset. If you're not here quick, he'll be dead. And I heard that. I heard the doctor say that on the phone. So they put me on the plane, and I was lost. I was an atheist. I didn't trust God. I didn't believe in God. I didn't pray to God. I just did exactly what I wanted to do. I was a free man, and I felt free to just do it, and I was. God let me be free to do just exactly whatever kind of silly thing I wanted to do, whatever kind of sinful thing I wanted, just carelessly live my life the way I wanted to live it. And because he gives us freedom to act, freedom of agency, it's called. You're a free agent. God lets you be. He doesn't have to let you be, but he respects your freedom and lets you do it. But he also lets you live with the consequences of it. And, the wages of sin, as I've said, that's death. Well, they were strapping me into that airplane, and they had all these ringers of blood up above me. I wouldn't take the blood because I was afraid of getting AIDS. That was a big thing back then. And so anyway, I remember laying there, and I thought, I'm about to die. I don't want to die. So I thought, well, what if I pray? I thought, well, pray to what? I don't believe in God. Who am I going to pray to? But somehow I got it in my head, I better pray to God. So I prayed to him. I said, well, I can't ask this based upon my own goodness because I'm not good. Not according to your book. I do all kinds of things that are wrong. But for the sake of my wife and my children, if you let me live, I promise that I will deal with you. I didn't even know what deal with him meant, but I knew that I needed to deal with him. I think if you're lost, you know that you need to deal with God. Because I was an atheist, and yet when it came up against a really hard condition of about to die type condition, I knew in my heart that I needed to deal with God, whatever that meant. And I promised him. I said, I promise I'll deal with you if you'll let me live for the sake of my family. Of course, the truth was I was afraid to die. It wasn't just for the sake of my family, it was for my sake. So even though prayer was a lie, even the motivation that I gave to it, to God in the prayer, was a lie. I wasn't praying for myself, I said, but it was for them. But I was praying for myself because I was afraid to die. Are you afraid to die? I'm not now, but I was then, because somehow I knew that when I died, it was going to be bad for me, even though I didn't believe in God. Yet I guess somewhere down there I must have, because when I was right up against it, I begged him to let me live. I got to a hospital. About an hour later, they checked me out. And this head surgeon says, we were all ready to cut you open and fix this ruptured spleen that you've got. He said, but you just stopped bleeding. And he told me when it was. It was right then in that airport at the time that plane took off, because I knew when it was. He said, yeah, we've been taking your hematocrit. It's a reading of red blood cells, and as a percentage of your blood. And he said, we've been taking it regularly, and at this point right here, and he gave me the time, I forget what it was, like, I don't know, maybe 9 o'clock or something in the morning. He said, it never dropped anymore after this time. And we took it during the flight. We had the nurses taking it, every so many minutes of the flight. And we ran all those, and you haven't bled since then. So we're just going to let you sit here for about a week or two and not move and not do anything, because it looks like you're healing yourself. Now I heard all that, and I survived it. I never had surgery for it. My spleen just healed itself. It just happened. It just happened. I thought. And guess what? When that scare went away, when I went home later, and I didn't give a second thought to dealing with God because I got a respite. He let me live. Therefore, I just went back to being the atheist that I'd always been, or at least for a long time I've been an atheist, and I wasn't about to change. In other words, because God's judgment against me was mercifully forestalled. He just says, you know what? Okay. You said you'd deal with me, then I'll keep you alive. In his very mercy, I use that for an occasion to harden my heart against dealing with God. That's how perverse we are. That's how wicked humans are. That we'll take his very mercy and just throw that in his teeth and say, there's no God. Look at here, I'm fine. Everything's honky-dory, as we'd say in the South. Everything's just fine. So what do we need a God for? I don't know. Maybe that doesn't mean anything to you. But let me tell you something. It meant something to God, because the very next thing that we read here in verse 16, and I'll just touch on it, and then next week we'll talk about it more, Lord willing, if there is a next week. And if I'm here next week and you're there, it says, and the Lord said unto Moses, say unto Aaron, stretch out thy rod and smite the dust of the land, that it may become lice throughout all the land of Egypt. As soon as Pharaoh reneged on letting the people go, because God had shown him mercy in removing the frogs at his request, then God got angry with him for that refusal. For that it's just a vicious thing to ask God for help, to make a promise to God, like he promised to send those people forth, like I promised to deal with him. It's viciously wicked to God to treat him like a fool and promise a thing that you don't ever do. I'm lucky that he didn't take me out then and there. He let me live it's a pretty good while. It was from 86 to 97. So he let me live 11 years longer. And then I finally dealt with God. I finally began to call upon him and pray to him for salvation and forgiveness of sins. And I determined in my heart I would never stop seeking him until he saved me or I died in the process. Now that's the type of mindset you need if you're going to find God. I know it's been kind of off topic some here, but these are old stories that you know. And we'll talk about them. We'll try to throw things in here that matter to you now, perhaps. Anyway, God bless you. Goodbye.